because there's just a lot of material, but stay with me if you can. I want to go back to what we said with the Psalms. Just go back with me to Psalm 98. We'll start with that, because I want to work our way. This plays into the theme of what we're talking about today. And I'll tie it into as many other things as we can. So today our Psalm 98 Psalm 98 open with, "Oh, sing to the Lord a new song, for he has done marvelous things." And you'll notice that I said that if you go back to chapter 90 of the Psalms, we are talking about Moses. We start with this third book. The third book of the Tefillah starts with Moses. Notice the superscription. A prayer of Moses, the man of God. So we have returned to Moses. Now we're in the Psalms, and this is the opening to book 4, to book 4, which is Psalm 90 to 106. We're going to end up with a book 5, and book 5 really ends with this paean of praise, this massive amount of praise at the end, in Psalms 146 to 150. But the Psalms are broken into 5 books because we have 5 books of Moses, and so David gets 5 books as well. Okay? So now we're in book 4, and book 4 opens with chapter 90. This is the Psalm, a prayer of Moses, the man of God. Notice Psalm 92 is a song for the Sabbath day. Okay, so into the Sabbath. Then notice what happens. Chapter 93 opens with "The Lord reigns." Okay. Then you have chapter 96, "Oh, sing to the Lord a new song." Chapter 97, "The Lord reigns." Chapter 98, "Sing to the Lord a new song." Chapter 99, "The Lord reigns." And there's this juxtaposition of the Lord's reign with a new song. What's fascinating is the first time we hear of the Lord's reign is in a song. In Exodus 15, we just came through this, the song of the sea that the children of Israel sing when they go through the Red Sea is Adonai Yimlok Leolam Va'ed. The Lord God will reign forever and ever. So it's interestingly in a song that we hear this first time, this concept of the reign of God. And I want to try to tie all this in, because go with me now to the book of Revelation, chapter 14. Revelation chapter 14. So Revelation chapter 14, here's one of the places in the apostolic scriptures where we get this concept of the new song. Notice Revelation 14 and verse 3. I'm going to skip down to verse 3. You can read the first 2 verses later, but it says this: "They sang as it were a new song before the throne, before the 4 living creatures and the elders, and no one could learn the song except the 144,000 who were redeemed from the earth." And I'm arguing that the song is about God's redemption and about his kingship. It's juxtaposed in the Psalms. The Lord reigns, sing a new song. The Lord reigns, sing a new song. So these are the ones who were not defiled with women, for they were virgins. And it goes on down here. And if you look at verse 12, it says, "Here is the patience of the saints. Here are those who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Yeshua." Notice the parallel. They keep the commandments of God and faith in Yeshua. Okay? Now look at verse 14. Same chapter 14, verse 14. "Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and on the cloud one like the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, 'Thrust in your sickle and reap, for the time has come for you to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe.' He who sat on the cloud thrust his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped. Then another angel came out of the temple." Now notice this. Another angel came out of the temple, which is in heaven. Notice that. Just mark that just for a second. Another angel came out of the temple, which is in heaven. He also having a sharp sickle. And another angel came from the altar, who had power over fire. And he cried out with a loud voice, and a loud cry to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, 'Thrust in your sharp sickle, and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe.'" Okay, so but notice that this is a temple in heaven. Okay. Now I want to go back to what we spoke about last week. Last week I mentioned that the book of Genesis opens with this idea of, we translate it in the beginning, but it really should be translated, in my estimation, in a beginning. Because there existed things before the beginning, before we get to this earth. And one of those things that existed is a tabernacle or a temple in the heavens. How do we know that? Go with me to Exodus chapter 25. Exodus chapter 25. This is our reading for today. So in a beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth. That's about what's going on down here. However, things have been created in the heavenly realms already. We'll talk about that in just a moment here. But notice it says this, verse 9, 25:9, according to all that I show you, that is, the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of all its furnishings, so you shall make it. You say to yourself, what pattern? God unrolls some blueprint to Moses. It says, Moses, I want you to make another one of these. And the sages saw this and they went, there must be one already in existence. And there we know that there is. We see it in Revelation. It tells us there was a tabernacle or a temple in the heavens. So that we're never left without one. Even if one should be destroyed here or abandoned here, there is always one in the heavenly realm. Notice verse 40 of chapter 25. If you notice how it ended, it said this, and see to it that you make them according to the pattern which was shown you on the mountain. Our word pattern, tabit. So it's a blueprint. So God, in a sense, says to Moses, take some notes. I have a blueprint I want to show you. And what you're going to do is you're going to build me a place to reside amongst you. We're going to call it the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting. We're going to call it the Mishkan, the gathering, the place where I will dwell. We're going to call it a number of names, but it's going to be the place where I will dwell amongst you. Now, the first article that comes, the first thing we discuss when we come out of this, when we get to this temple, is the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant has on top of it two cherubim. And it's interesting because the Psalms say that he sits enthroned above the cherubim. The Psalms say that God is enthroned above the cherubim. We have the pillar of cloud that is above the cherubim in the daytime, and the pillar of fire by night that hovers over this Ark of the Covenant, and it says that the Ark is his footstool. We get to Genesis chapter 3, verse 24. We're 3 chapters in. Remember, these are chapter divisions are arbitrary. They're created later on. But we have this in a beginning, and then when Adam and Hava are they are exiled out of Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, he places 2 cherubim at the entrance to the east of Eden, who have flaming swords that are able to move in every direction to guard the entrance to the Garden of Eden, Gan Eden. It means garden of pleasure, orchard of pleasure. So we had a number of British scholars who began to realize, as they looked at Genesis and then looked at the tabernacle, that they saw multiple comparisons between the Garden of Eden and the later tabernacle. So I gave you this handout. Gary sent it around to all of you. Walking around, I sent it to you as well yesterday. And it shows you the comparisons between the Garden of Eden and between the later tabernacle. Both in a literary way and in a grammatical way, and even in structural ways, the Garden of Eden was initially a tabernacle. It was a tabernacle. We think of it as this garden where God just places Adam and Eve. And while it was that, anybody reading it, having read through Exodus, would have said, oh my stars, there are all kinds of comparisons between the Garden of Eden and this tabernacle. We now have more than just the 17 that I've listed for you here. So it cannot be just by accident that the Garden of Eden was made to sound like the later tabernacle. It was where God walked with his people, where he ruled, if you will, with his people. All right. So, all that to say that the initial tabernacle is built in the Garden of Eden, and then God drives them out. But we get to chapter 25 and we have redemption. God says, you know what, I'm not through. I'm going to actually have you build me another place. You're going to build me another place, and I want you to put an ark in the room that only I will be in. One other person can go there one time a year. And you're going to put this ark, and it's going to have the commandments inside of it, and I want you to put 2 cherubim on the top of it, just like we had in the garden. And you're going to have this place where I will meet with you, and it will have the commandments inside of it that I give you on the top of the mountain, and I will speak to you from above the ark and give you commandments. And this is what you see in the Solomonic temple. And the Solomonic temple is an expansion of what we see in the tabernacle. It greatly expands the tabernacle in many ways. It's a bigger place.
I think I have a question.
Okay.
Well, tying part of this together, because also to say that the Garden of Eden was actually in Jerusalem?
No,
or there's a discussion of that?
The Garden of Eden was, I believe, was in what we would call Mesopotamia, between the rivers, between the Tigris and the Euphrates River, somewhere in that region. So, because as it's described for us in Genesis, the description of it at least brings in the Tigris and Euphrates, which would put it up in what we would call Mesopotamia, what today would be Iraq, Iran, that region. The temple of Solomon is built obviously in Jerusalem.
Well, of course, but there's some. I maybe with Mark built, but some of the sages talked about that being also where Garden of Eden was, which also makes sense to where Melchizedek came from. It's
That's a possibility. It's a real possibility. What you're saying is, I think, is a real possibility. So I don't know. I haven't studied it out enough to all that. So I want to. Yeah, we'll talk more about that. That's, but I want you to see these comparisons so that you see that there's this God-given commands in the Garden of Eden, the cherubim in the Garden of Eden, commands in the tabernacle, commands in the Ark of the Covenant. All right, so this is the build-up to what we're seeing is we have Garden of Eden, we have the Solomonic Temple. Now go with me to 1 Kings chapter 8. 1 Kings chapter 8. I'm going to show you something. Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings in most of your Bibles. Look at 1 Kings chapter 8. And this is what Solomon says at the end of, he's dedicating the temple. He's dedicating the temple. And notice David is allowed to amass the material for the building of the tabernacle, but because he'd been a man of war, David was not allowed to build it. Solomon, his son, is allowed to build it. Solomon builds it, and in chapter 8 we have the dedication of the Solomonic temple, which in a sense comes and replaces the tabernacle. The tabernacle was a tent that was movable. Now that they're a steadied people in the land, they build a house for the Lord. Verse 41, moreover concerning a foreigner who is not of your people Israel. This is 8:41, 1 Kings 8:41. Moreover concerning a foreigner who is not of your people Israel. And that word foreigner is no Cree, but has come from a far country for your name's sake. For they will hear of your great name and your strong hand and your outstretched arm. That's Exodus language. They will hear about the Exodus and what you did delivering Israel out of Egypt. When he comes and prays towards this temple, hear in heaven your dwelling place and do according to all for which the foreigner calls to you, that all peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your people Israel, and that they may know that this temple which I have built is called by your name. Okay, that word foreigner there, no Cree. The foreigner who comes into Israel doing business but does not live there. Now, look at Isaiah chapter 56. Isaiah 56. Same word, no Cree. Same word, no Cree. And look what he says in verse 6. Isaiah 56, verse 6. Also the sons of the foreigner, no Cree, who joined themselves to the Lord to serve him and to love the name of the Lord. So to love the Lord, to serve him, and the name of the Lord are equated here. To be his servants. Everyone who keeps from defiling the Sabbath, that would be holding on to the Mosaic covenant. The sign of the Mosaic covenant is the Sabbath. Even them I will bring to my holy mountain, Mount Zion, and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations. Okay. So this temple is important, but here's the interesting thing. We don't have that temple there today. You go to Mount Zion today, and you have the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and you have the Dome of the Rock. And the 38-acre Temple Mount that Solomon rebuilt is no longer housing the house of the Lord. Ever since the time of 70 AD, Titus, the Roman general, comes into Jerusalem and he burns the temple and destroys it. And we have archaeological evidence for this burning of the temple. You can see ash layers and archaeological. There's a place right outside, just outside of the temple, called there's a priestly family called the Katros family. And you could go to the burnt house, you go down into these stairs, and you can see the remains of where this priestly family lived. The priestly families lived around the tabernacle. Makes sense. And they call it the burnt house. And you could go down there and see where this family lived that served in the temple. And you can see the ash layer on the rocks in the area where they dwelled. So we know that, and the Romans tell us this as well. So we have Roman historians telling us, as well as Josephus telling us. So we have both Roman historians and we have Jewish historians telling us that at 70 AD, Titus, the Roman general, destroys the temple in Jerusalem. And since that time, the temple has never been rebuilt. So it's been destroyed. Now, in the time of Yeshua, the temple still stood. In the time of Paul, the temple still stood. And while that temple stood, both Yeshua and Paul visited that temple on a regular basis. Did they have problems with its leadership? Absolutely. They didn't have a problem with the temple itself. They had a problem with the people running it and leading it. Okay? But the temple itself was not a problem. And they went to it on a regular basis. And in fact, you see Yeshua saying to a leper who is healed, he says, "Go show yourself to the priest and do the sacrifice that Moses required." He had no problem with the temple itself. He had no problem with the Mosaic covenant and the Mosaic laws. He did have a problem with those who were leading the temple and were running the process. Yeah.
And in fact, he did that thing with the sacrifices because people were thinking that he did have a problem with the temple, not
right.
the leadership. Right.
So so what Mark is saying is he did this because he wanted people to know clearly that he did not have a problem with the temple in and of itself. He had a problem with the leadership of the temple and the way they were operating. That's a different issue. Yes.
Is this the same temple that Solomon built?
Yes and no. Good question. He says, is this the temple that Solomon built? So Solomon builds a temple, but the temple that Solomon built goes into disrepair. And then it's, I forget the name of the king, I'm just losing it right now, that rebuilt it. But when he rebuilt it, it did not go back to the former glory that Solomon had given it.
Why was this for David allowed to, again, you said, because he was a man of war?
Yeah, so...
But he obeyed God in those wars.
Yes, he did. But it's interesting that God says to David, because you have blood on your hands, you've been a man who fought so much, and my house, it's a peaceful place. So he's basically saying, you can amass the materials, but you will not be allowed to build it. He allows David to amass all the materials, but your son, Solomon, will build it. And it's interesting, this too, because I don't know if you noticed the reading of Kings, it said that whenever you quarry this, you have to quarry it out there. I don't want any implements of iron striking it inside the temple. Because implements of iron were implements of war. So I don't want any implements of war being sounded in the temple as it's being built. If you're going to quarry it out there, notice how many people that Solomon had. 80,000 in one place, and he's dividing people up into huge groups in order to quarry this stuff. If you go to the Temple Mount today, you can go underneath into the tunnel, and there are rocks that are the size of that room right there at the base of it, that are just massively huge. And they are still in place. This is the bedrock foundation that they didn't destroy. They couldn't uproot it. They were huge. All kinds of theories on how they got these rocks into place, but they're massive. And there's many of them. They're multi-ton and they're huge. They're just, yes.
I was just wondering, on Isaiah 56:8, where it says, "The Lord, Lord."
In 6:8,
Yeah.
the Lord says, "The Lord God." In Isaiah,
Yeah.
it says,
Oh, mine says the Lord, small case. and
it's
then
Adonai Yod-Heh-Vah-Heh.
Okay.
And in that case,
And I'm
it's,
just wondering, is that significant? I mean, 'cause it's
yeah, I think anytime you have a double name like that, it's drawing attention to it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I want to go back to something else here real quick. Yeah, so anytime you have this double use of the name, it's definitely pointing to say, hey, look here closely. Absolutely. Notice what happens. Paul the Apostle does not have a problem with the temple either. How we know this? We know that the early believers in Acts were going to the temple at the time of sacrifice and made that a time of prayer. You would sacrifice at 9 a.m. in the morning and you would sacrifice at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, equivalent. And these were times of prayer. So the times of sacrifice, they would go, Christ believers, Jewish Christ believers, would go to the temple and they would pray. And they would offer sacrifice.
You're speaking after Yeshua died.
I'm speaking before he died and after he died. Here's why. We know that they went after he died because the Apostle Paul in Acts chapter 21, he pays for 4 other people who are completing a Nazirite vow. Numbers chapter 5 and 6, Numbers chapter 6 mentions the Nazirite vow. The Nazirite vow requires multiple sacrifices be made. Not for sin, but for purification. Okay? So, we think of sacrifices as something for sin. Most of the sacrifices had to do with purification and with thanksgiving and with a lot of other things. So there only a couple of the sacrifices had to do with the dealing of sin. And the sacrifices did not cure you from sin. They did not heal you from sin. What they did show was that a person who had repented in their heart was now willing to be obedient to God. That was the purpose of the sacrifices. The sacrifices were not efficacious for forgiving your sin. They were efficacious for showing that you were repentant. That you had to have repentance first, then bring a sacrifice. And we see clearly after the death of Yeshua, the Jewish Christ believers are still going to the temple and still offering sacrifices. This is why we see Ezekiel's temple. Ezekiel describes a temple that we do not have with any king. No king of Israel ever built a temple like Ezekiel describes. And in that temple, Ezekiel describes sacrifices being made. So it's interesting. Now you can take that metaphorical or you can take that literal. Some take it metaphorical and say, well, it's a metaphor. He gives pretty specific instructions.
There's a lot of chapters for a metaphor.
It's a lot of chapters for a metaphor. And here's the reason why I have difficulty with it being a metaphor. Moses is given specific instructions on how to build a tabernacle. Solomon builds a literal tabernacle. Historically, nobody even denies that. So it would be very odd for Ezekiel to give us no hint that this is just a grand metaphor, because he goes into the same type of description that we get with the tabernacle. Here's the cubits, here build it this way, build it this way. If this is just a grand metaphor, we spilled a lot of ink to describe something that's just metaphorical. And in the other instances where things were described to this extent, they were literally physically built. Now I want to show you something. Go with me back to Exodus chapter 25, just for a moment. Exodus chapter 25. Now watch how structurally the text is built to mimic the Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis. in chapter 25, verse 1, 25, verse 1, it says, the Lord spoke to Moses, and he gives Moses these instructions on the tabernacle. That phraseology is not used again until we get to, go all the way over to chapter 30, verse 11. Write this down, chapter 30, verse 11. It says, again, then the Lord spoke to Moses. That's the second time. Chapter 30, verse 11. Then verse 17 says, of chapter 30, then the Lord spoke to Moses. That's number 3. Verse 22 says, then the Lord spoke to Moses. That's number 4. Verse 34 says, then the Lord spoke to Moses. That's number 5. Chapter 31, verse 1, then the Lord spoke to Moses. That's 6. Verse 12 of chapter 31, and the Lord spoke to Moses. That's number 7. How many days do we have in the creation account? Total, 7. 6 days of creation, 1 day of Shabbat. Now notice what happens just after he finishes the seventh phase of the tabernacle. It says in verse 13, speak to the children of Israel, saying, surely my Sabbath you shall keep. It is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. So then he discusses the Sabbath. So the tabernacle is built in 7 phases, just like the 7 days of the creation that we have in Genesis 1 and 2. In Genesis 1, we get to the end, we have a Sabbath. Get to the end of the building of the tabernacle, and we're going to talk about the Sabbath again. Because why? Because the Sabbath is sacred time. The tabernacle is sacred space. And sacred space and sacred time have to coalesce at some point. But the Sabbath is a picture. The Sabbath actually trumps the sacred time trumps sacred space. How do we know that? You give me some examples of where you think sacred time, the Sabbath, would sit. Yes.
When they were building I don't remember if it was the temple or the tabernacle, they said not to build on the Shabbat because time was sacred.
Yes. So, yes, absolutely. So she says that whenever the tabernacle was being built, as the tabernacle was being constructed, you had to stop building the tabernacle on the Sabbath. Even because somebody would have said, well, this is a pretty noble thing. We're building this tabernacle for God, so this is pretty good, right? We should still continue building, right? And God said, no, even for the building of the tabernacle, I want you to cease your labors. How else do we know that sacred time trumps sacred space? Not everybody at once. Just one at a time. Here's another one. One of those other ones is you have